So a little less about me and a little bit more about critical transitions. Take it away, Allison.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. So let me share screen. Oops, I'm not able to share.
Sorry, it's my fault. It should work now.
Okay, thank you. All right, and let's see if I can get this shared on the right screen. Do you see the normal view or the notes view?
We see the presenters mode, the notes view.
The
wrong one.
Thank you. How's that?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, great. And as I was mentioning earlier, we're getting our first rain here in California. So the internet tends to be a little iffy, and I'm going to turn off my video just to try to ensure that it works well. Of course, all the buttons disappear as soon as you share screen. I guess I have to back out of this for a second. Oops. Okay, does that look right?
Yeah, perfect.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting me to be here, and thank you for the introduction, Tricia. As Tricia mentioned, I thought that today what I'd talk about is my work on Holocene and abrupt vegetation change, which is work that I started as a postdoc at the University of Wisconsin-Madison as part of the ACES group. And I want to just start right off the bat and take this moment to acknowledge the intellectual contributions of my collaborators there, and of course the support from the Wisconsin Alumni Research Fund, which supported my time at Wisconsin. So this work that I'm going to talk about is motivated by the fact that we're living in an era of high magnitude anthropogenic impacts on the globe, which is a big part of my post-ACES research as well. But for many ecosystems, we don't know the normal range of variation that would be experienced in the absence of human impacts. And so this is kind of the first essential step in understanding whether ecosystems will change in the future and when that will happen and what the causes are. And of course, because of these anthropogenic impacts, we have reason to be concerned that ecosystems will experience big changes in the future, which we're actually, of course, already starting to see. So the fossil record gives us a way to measure those ecological fluctuations over long periods of time, over different expressions of climate, and prior to novel stressors like invasive species, for example, which can make it challenging to understand the underlying dynamics in ecosystems. So I think most of the audience here today either works with or is really familiar with sediment cores from lakes and other lacustrine sites, marine cores too. These cores preserve numerous kinds of data which tell us about past ecosystems. All of my examples today focus on pollen, which we can use to reconstruct past vegetation, but the methods and the conclusions I'll be talking about are all applicable to, I think, most other kinds of data that you can extract from the geologic record beyond sediment cores and beyond pollen. Sediment cores also preserve various kinds of geochemical information that can be used to reconstruct things like past climate. And this gives us the ability to directly link ecological changes with possible drivers using data derived from the same source, which I think is kind of a big advantage of this sort of study system. There are, of course, hundreds of sediment cores across the globe, and that data is increasingly available through databases like Neotoma, for example. Here you're looking at a now kind of outdated map of the fossil pollen sites in that database. And I show this because we can use these many records to synthesize across space and I think kind of test our understanding of ecological relationships by treating these many different sites as replicates. Not all of these sites, but system-specific replicates. So today I first want to talk a little bit about abrupt change from kind of a theoretical perspective, and then I'll show you some of the work that I've been doing to take that theoretical framework and apply it to empirical paleoecological data sets. Oops. So this is from a 2018 paper, Radazak et al., which the University of Wisconsin ACES group put out. If we classify all the different ways an ecosystem can behave over time, there are four main categories. Of course, there's no change. There's linear change, there's abrupt and persistent change, and there's abrupt and temporary change. And I'll just mention that the abruptness of the change is kind of arbitrary. So an abrupt change could, depending on your perspective, include a whole spectrum of timescales, including things like a shift from forest to herbaceous cover following a wildfire, or the geologically rapid shift from a glacial period to an interglacial, for example. These categories of behavior are each an expression of underlying ecological dynamics between the driver, like temperature, and the state, for example, what the vegetation composition is. So whether or not a change is abrupt depends first on how fast the driver changes, and second on this driver-state relationship illustrated on the bottom row. So you can imagine that if you have linear dynamics where, for example, the vegetation is linearly related to temperature, a rapid change in temperature would lead to a rapid change in vegetation. On the other hand, if you have threshold dynamics highlighted in the bottom right here, when you cross a threshold in temperature, no matter how slowly, it will still cause a rapid change in vegetation. And again, rapid is sort of system dependent. The difference between these two types of threshold with and without hysteresis is that the threshold without hysteresis, you could simply reverse the driver to reverse the state change, or reduce temperature to return vegetation to what it was before. It sounds like you guys have been talking about these kinds of changes for the last few talks, but I'll just plow ahead here. So when you cross the threshold with hysteresis, it's called a critical transition. And these thresholds with hysteresis are, I'd say, particularly alarming from a conservation perspective, but there are also systems where you can often measure loss of resilience prior to an actual abrupt change. So we have the potential to anticipate them and also to recognize them in the past in order to uncover these system-specific driver-state relationships, kind of illustrated on the bottom. I'm sure you've seen a million ball and cup diagrams, but to illustrate this another way, imagine that you have an ecosystem with two alternative stable states represented by these basins, and your system is currently in one of those states represented by the blue ball. The deeper the basin, the harder it is for the system to move out, and the steeper the slope, the faster the system will return to equilibrium if it's perturbed. So when the ball is perturbed, it moves a little bit before settling back to the bottom of the basin. If you have an external driver changing, like maybe aridification is taking place, the shape of these basins can change so that through time, one of these basins becomes shallower while the other one gets deeper. And now if the ball is perturbed, it moves a little bit further from equilibrium and takes a little bit longer to return. And finally, you reach a point where one basin either disappears altogether or a small perturbation to the ball can send it off into the next basin. And that's the critical transition. And after a critical transition, even if the driver is reversed and the two basins are reestablished, the ball won't necessarily return because of those feedbacks that I mentioned earlier. So if you measure the movements of the ball through time, you find that the variance of those movements increases, the length of time it takes for the ball to recover from the perturbation increases. And because the return time is longer, autocorrelation also increases. Obviously, this is an abstraction from a real ecosystem, but you could imagine going out and measuring something like tree cover over time, then measuring these statistics on that variable with the hope of detecting resilience loss before your system changed from, say, a woodland to a grassland. So as you may know, these measures and others like them are called resilience indicators, or sometimes they're called early warning indicators. And identifying critical transitions in the fossil record using metrics like these would be incredibly valuable because it would allow us to figure out what drives ecosystem to this point, what happens afterwards, and maybe even what conditions are required to reverse it. The problem, of course, is that to measure things like variance and autocorrelation in time series, you generally need a data set that has many samples. They should be evenly spaced in time. You need no or very little time averaging, and you should have no missing data. These requirements are difficult to achieve even with typical modern data sets, and paleoecological data sets, at least in my experience, rarely meet any of these criteria. And that's because sedimentation rates can vary for a lot of reasons. For example, at the top of lakes, we typically find a quasi-exponential relationship like what's shown on the bottom right. And in addition, samples are typically taken at regular depth intervals. And so the resulting time series is both discontinuous and the samples are irregularly spaced in time. So it's been unclear if we can even apply these resilience indicators to data from sediment cores and uncover a true signal, although people have been doing it for a few years now. And I want to just emphasize that although I'm talking about the specific system of sediment cores, there are other kinds of data like this. You could imagine taking plant surveys, for example, but maybe you don't get out into the field every year or something like that. So my collaborators, Zach Radizak, Jack Williams, Steve Carpenter, and I, all part of the ACES group, wanted to test how effective resilience indicators are in these kinds of systems. So we constructed a model loosely based on the prairie-forest ecotone of the upper Midwest. Here you can see the prairie-forest ecotone. The modern boundary of the ecotone is, hopefully you can see my cursor, generally here. The yellow is prairie, the darker green is forest. And we know that this boundary has moved around during the Holocene. Those movements have been studied in quite a bit of detail using a network of sediment cores from lakes across the region. And there's strong evidence that when an individual site shifts from prairie to forest and vice versa, that it's in fact a critical transition where you have that kind of threshold behavior. So we developed a model of a woodland grassland system with alternative stable states. The model is shown on the bottom here. This model is not parameterized on the upper Midwest prairie forest ecotone, but it's broadly analogous. And this is a very, very well studied model system where the vegetation can flip rapidly to a grassland state if tree cover declines enough, which is caused by declining precipitation with fires as the mechanism for maintaining the grassland. We used this model to simulate time series of tree cover, and the red line here represents the precipitation driver and how we changed that over time. So we either didn't change it at all, as on the top, or we changed it abruptly, or we changed it gradually. And the gray line shows the simulated tree cover. So in this figure, only the bottom time series represents a critical transition where one stable state is disappearing over time. And so this is the only time series for which we'd expect to recover those statistical signals of resilience loss. And to evaluate whether the processes that generate a sediment core data set would transform the statistical signature of resilience indicators, we subjected each time series to modeled taphonomic processes. And specifically what we did is we applied an age depth model reflecting changes in sediment deposition rate. We also applied a sampling scheme meant to reflect the way a typical paleoecologist might take samples from a core. So in these age models, we have two linear models on the top, two broken stick models where the time averaging shifts suddenly from one mean to another, which is pretty common. And then we have the exponential model on the bottom. And these are jagged just because we made it so that the sedimentation rate had a constant mean, but could vary a little bit from one sample to the other. So to illustrate that, here is a simulated time series where tree cover is modeled at 10,000 points representing annual measurements. Now imagine pollen from those trees is deposited in the lake. The sediment is compacted using that age depth model. So time averaging is greater in the older sediments. And if we were to sample every centimeter of sediment, we would be able to reconstruct this black time series. But imagine we've sampled the core the way a pollen analyst might. In this example, we've taken a sediment sample every 4 centimeters, represented by the red dots. So the red points here are the time series we actually have to work with in terms of measuring resilience indicators. Okay, now I'm changing my example time series here. Now you're looking at a critical transition, gradually forced. The next step is to measure resilience indicators, which is done in a rolling window. Oops. And you can see on the right-hand side here, the standard deviation and autocorrelation calculated for this example time series in the rolling window. That vertical line on all the plots here is corresponding to the same time point. We then calculate Kendall's tau for each resilience indicator. Kendall's tau is a trend statistic, which basically tells you the strength of the correlation Technically, it's the ordinal association between time and the resilience indicator. So a Kendall's tau of -1 would be a negative trend. Kendall's tau of 0 would be basically no trend, and a Kendall's tau of 1 would be strongly positive. And we expect to see values close to 1 for resilience indicators when a critical transition is taking place. So in our study, we iterated this process, simulating hundreds of time series, calculating the standard deviation and the autocorrelation, and then calculating the Kendall's tau. And on the bottom right here, you see a histogram of Kendall's tau values for standard deviation across all those iterations. I'll just tell you right now that this is not the histogram that goes with this particular time series. It's just one that I had handy. So the next step is to compare the signal of resilience indicators from different kinds of time series. Again, this is fake data just to illustrate the process. But for example, on the top, we have one kind of time series. On the bottom, we have another, an abruptly forced shift. And you can see that they each have a distribution of Kendall's tau values. And we want to know if these are statistically different from one another. Can we tell these two types of change apart? So we used something called receiver operating characteristic analysis, which is a way of measuring how much overlap there is between two distributions. And without getting too much into the details of that, this method gives you a measure called area under the curve, which ranges from 0.5 to 1, with 0.5 meaning full overlap and 1 meaning no overlap. And it's not, by the way, the area under either of these curves or the area under their shared overlap. It's sort of a different curve. But the important thing is that 0.5 means total overlap and 1 means no overlap. So in this example, we have an AUC of 0.81, meaning there's not very much overlap between the two. And this method gives us another important figure called the optimum decision threshold value, distinguishing one distribution from the other. So if you're above this value, you probably belong to the dark blue distribution, this value being the dashed line here. And if you're below, you probably belong to the distribution on the bottom. So we use this method to compare many different types of time series with different age models and different sampling schemes. And to summarize, what we found is that the sedimentation model really does alter the statistical signature of resilience indicators, but it's far worse for exponential sedimentation than for linear or broken stick age models. With linear or broken stick models, it's still possible to accurately distinguish critical transitions from other kinds of ecological change, but that's not the case for exponential models. I think this is really important because exponential sedimentation is typical of sediments deposited in the last 200 years or so, which is, these are the sediments we often use to explore anthropogenic impacts that might be causing critical transitions. We also found that while discontinuous sampling does dampen the signals of resilience indicators, the degree to which it obscures signals is strongly dependent on the sedimentation model. And finally, we found that variance or standard deviation was robust to the age model and the sampling, but autocorrelation wasn't. So autocorrelation signals were sort of blown out by all of these processes. So while these simple statistical indicators work for some data sets, they're just not really appropriate for others. And for those sites, we have to find a different method that can accommodate differences in time averaging across the core, that can accommodate these irregularly spaced samples. And I'll just add that altering the sampling strategy is one approach that could help mitigate this issue. So this is all very well and good in a simulated circumstance, but we'd really like to be able to apply these lessons to real data. So let's take a look at an example site. This is data from Steel Lake, Minnesota in the upper Midwestern United States. And you can see that it experienced a rapid shift from woodland to prairie state during the Holocene. Here we're looking at percent woody cover at Steel Lake. This is data from Williams et al. 2009, where they reconstructed woody cover from pollen data from many sites in the upper Midwest. And this dashed line here shows the timing of the regime shift or the critical transition based on a Bayesian change point analysis. In addition to the pollen in the Steel Lake core, Nelson and Hu 2008 measured the percentage of quartz and feldspar, which is a proxy for aridification. And you can see, I hope, this yellow shaded region is the period of increasing quartz and feldspar preceding a very sudden increase, which is coincident with the shift to prairie. So we potentially have aridification as a driver of a state shift at this site. If you measure standard deviation of the woody cover for that period of aridification, you see a very steady increase in standard deviation that Kendall's tau is 0.82, which is very strong, which implies that resilience loss is taking place, but this doesn't account for the age depth relationship or for the sample spacing and resolution in this particular core, which of course we now know can really alter the signals of resilience loss. So using our grassland woodland model, we simulated time series with either an abruptly forced critical transition on the top, where you wouldn't expect to have resilience loss, or a gradually forced critical transition on the bottom, which we might expect based on Steel Lake from the quartz and feldspar data. And then we applied the Steel Lake age depth model and sampling scheme and measured Kendall's tau on those simulated time series. And when you compare the results, you see that there's a really strong overlap between the abruptly and gradually forced critical transitions when you use these same age model and sample spacing as Steel Lake. We know there's strong overlap because the AUC is 0.51 or essentially full overlap with no discriminant power. However, the observed Kendall's tau is higher than the optimum decision threshold, which suggests maybe this is a gradually forced critical transition. But we then wondered, okay, so what could you do to answer this question under the circumstance if you were really interested in doing this at Steel Lake? So we ran another simulation, and this time we used twice as many samples. We doubled the sampling resolution for Steel Lake. And we found that, yes, in fact, our AUC increases to 0.73. Our decision threshold goes down, and this tells us that more samples would, in fact, give us a higher capacity to tell these two types of change apart at Steel Lake. So stepping back for a minute, I want to just say that I think one of the important points this study makes is that simulations and process-based models can be directly employed to help us understand specific empirical data better. I think often simulations and empirical data aren't integrated particularly with one another because it's hard. But I also think that this is a direction we should be moving with this kind of research. So I now want to present another case study that comes at this question from, I think, the opposite direction, using a process-based understanding of a modern ecosystem to generate testable hypotheses about changes in the past. And we're going to move geographically westward from the upper Midwest to the Rocky Mountains. As many of you know, I'm sure the Rocky Mountains are the spine of mountains that run roughly north-south across North America, following this red arrow. These forests are characterized by periodic stand-replacing fires. And every time there's a fire, the slate is kind of wiped clean, providing opportunities for new trees to grow and the potential for compositional change. This is a normal process, the normal circumstance for these forests. But the concern is that increases in fire driven by climate change might cause this region to lose its forests altogether. This area is experiencing increasing summer and winter temperatures and decreasing precipitation, as many regions are. So wildfire size, severity, and frequency are tightly linked to climate. Over the last 40 years, as global temperatures have increased, and as the Western US has become more arid, the fuels, meaning the trees, have become drier. And this has led to much larger fires. You can see in this plot that fuels aridity on the x-axis is highly correlated with fire area on the y-axis, and that fires in the last 20 years, shown in red, have been larger than fires between 1980 and 2000. We're seeing changes in fire regime already. So relative to 1973 to 1982, wildfire burn time is 8 times longer, fire seasons are 84 days longer, fire burn area has increased 390%, and fire frequency has increased 140%. And I'll just note that these values come from a 2016 paper, so they're likely more extreme today even. So to illustrate schematically how this is connected to critical transitions, on the y-axis here we have the forest state, because different tree species have different environmental tolerances, there's an environmental threshold at which the forest composition will shift if environmental conditions change. We have fires occurring periodically. This causes a small change in state indicated by the blue line. And when the environment is constant, the forest recovers to pre-fire state after these disturbances. But if the environment's changing, for example, if aridification is taking place as it is in the Northern Rockies, the system will be slowly driven in a new direction, and at a certain point of fire can tip the system into a new state with different species composition illustrated by the red line here. So this is kind of how we understand this system to work, and my collaborators, Monica Turner, Kathy Whitlock, Virginia Iglesias, and I wanted to see if this hypothesized situation has been borne out in the past. So the modern vegetation pattern in this region established about 4,000 years ago, it really hasn't changed too much since. At lower elevations, you find sagebrush steppe. Above that, you have limber pine, often in combination with sagebrush and juniper. Above that, we have Douglas fir. That transitions to lodgepole pine, which forms these vast homogeneous stands. And finally, at higher elevations where it's too cold for lodgepole, we get spruce, fir, and whitebark pine. Each of these vegetation types has a different ecological adaptation to fire and a different strategy for either resisting fires or recovering. So with respect to recovery following fire, lodgepole has a canopy seed bank. So following fire, the regeneration of lodgepole is rapid and extremely prolific. It takes lodgepole about 5 to 15 years to make viable cones and pollen, which is pretty quick. In contrast, Douglas fir is slower to regenerate. It takes about 30 to 50 years to make viable cones. So you can imagine that a change in the fire frequency will lead to changes in local and eventually regional vegetation types. So for example, if a fire sweeps through a site every 20 years, obviously you won't be able to support Douglas fir because they take too long to mature, but lodgepole pine could persist. Limber pine is found in xeric or rocky exposed conditions, often co-occurring with juniper. This species tends to be edged out by more shade tolerant species like Douglas fir and lodgepole in sites that are more mesic. And finally, we have sagebrush steppe, which is xeric tolerant. It takes about 10 to 30 years to recover following fire. So because mature trees have wider environmental tolerances than seedlings do, the environmental conditions during the 20-year window following fires is really critical for determining which species will dominate in the long run, because individuals who come in after fires will generally live 100 or 200 years, even if the environmental conditions change over the course of their lifetimes. So post-fire recovery of these different vegetation types has been studied in a lot of detail for recent fires, particularly since I think it was the 1988 Yellowstone fires. So we have a lot of fodder for testable hypotheses about how the forest should change if the post-fire recruitment period is drier than usual or hotter than usual. And all of this context leads us to wonder if changing climate, specifically aridification and more frequent drought events paired with fires will lead to abrupt shifts in vegetation in these systems. So we asked if interactions between climate and fire catalyzed changes in the dominance of the taxa that I've just discussed. And we hypothesized that Douglas fir would be favored over lodgepole when fires were followed by dry periods, and that limber pine, juniper, sagebrush would be favored in the extreme drought conditions. And to answer this, we used a 2,500-year record from Crevice Lake in northern Yellowstone. Previous work at Crevice Lake has already reconstructed past vegetation, of course, as well as environmental proxies of summer temperature and winter precipitation. And of course, we also have charcoal information telling us about when fires occurred in the past. Here you see the record of abundance for each of these focal species or focal taxa. Mean abundance has remained pretty stable through time with plenty of fluctuations, as I hope you can see. And these red lines show fire events reconstructed from the charcoal. We looked at the abundance of each of these taxa following fires, and we assessed how those abundances related to environmental conditions during the 20-year recruitment window following the fire, shown by this pink shaded bar, which I hope you can see. It's a little bit thin. And the recruitment window, of course, is that period of time when seedlings are growing into adult trees. So to explain this in a little more detail, we used two methods to test this. First, we looked at the 20-year post-fire window and compared the pollen abundance of each of the 4 focal tree taxa with the climate proxies using Spearman's correlations. This is one example showing the standardized abundance of lodgepole pine or Pinus contorta against calcium carbonate, which is the proxy for summer temperature. And you can see that there's really no correlation. Obviously the p-value is 1, the rho value is 0.07, which is terrible. And this actually was true for all of the taxa that we looked at and for both climate proxies. You might be wondering why the points are open and filled, and that's because we also looked at whether pollen abundance of taxa increased or decreased after the fire. If the point is filled, it means that the pollen abundance was higher after the fire than it was before. If it's open, it was lower after the fire. And we used Mann-Whitney tests to see if this increase or decrease was correlated with climate following fire, which again, it wasn't in every case. We decided to use a modeling approach that I think overcomes some of the issues with the Spearman's tests. And we started by estimating the median amount of time between a pollen sample and the most recent prior fire. And that value turns out to be 56 years. We then divided our samples into those which had been preceded by a fire 40 to 100 years previous. And that 40 years was to allow for adult tree regeneration between the fire and the pollen sample. And for the pollen samples that weren't preceded by a fire in that window, that were preceded by a fire in that window, we quantified the climate proxies during the 20-year post-fire period, which is shown in pink. I hope you guys can see pink. I tried to make this red-green friendly, but I don't know if I did. So for those which were not preceded by a fire, we quantified the climate proxies in the 20-year window starting 56 years before. And then we built 2 ARIMA models, one which included the climate proxy and the presence or absence of fire, and one with an added interaction term. And that first model represents a situation where vegetation changes were driven by climate conditions in the long term, but not by conditions during the recruitment period specifically. And the second model has this interaction term, climate by fire, which accounts for the possible role of climate during the post-fire recruitment window. But using AIC to evaluate the 2 models, we found that the second model with the interaction was no more predictive of post-fire vegetation than the simpler model was. So to summarize, we found that post-fire abundance of these 4 taxa is not correlated with environmental conditions during the recruitment period following the fires, which was, as you'll recall, counter to our hypothesis based on the modern ecosystem. And the question is, why is that? One possible explanation is that precipitation and temperature are, of course, mediated by local factors. And so when we measure summer temperature and winter precipitation in the sediment record, we don't necessarily see exactly what the seedlings experienced. I think this is true of most paleoecological data. The local factors kind of interfere or add nuance, which I think can be overcome by expanding research to more sites. A second likely possibility is that the last 2,500 years at Crevice Lake haven't captured large enough shifts in climate to lead to major changes in vegetation. So we just haven't crossed thresholds that constrain post-fire tree regeneration, at least yet. So in the last couple minutes here, I just want to offer some concluding thoughts. First, I think we can all agree that there's a huge potential for using the fossil record to understand ecosystem dynamics and anticipate what will happen to species and communities in the future. Although my Northern Rockies example might seem like it fell short of that goal, I think it did tell us a lot about the range of climate tolerance in that system. And I think a next step would be to start looking at similar sites, for example, further to the south where climate thresholds may not have been crossed yet. Sorry, may have already been crossed. Second, the fossil record is useful for looking at both slow and fast ecological processes. And I started out in vertebrate paleontology, so maybe I'm guided more by that, but I think paleontology is sometimes seen as a field of slow changes, but I think we can be more nimble than this And I think this capacity will only increase with improved dating and higher resolution sampling. I also think that the research I've talked about today emphasizes the importance of sampling and analysis as an iterative process. So as we saw with the Steel Lake example, the first round of pollen samples established a pattern and a hypothesis, but a second round of pollen samples would likely be needed to confidently fingerprint resilience loss in that site. I realize that there are numerous logistical challenges to this, but I do think it's kind of necessary to answer certain questions. And finally, just to close, I want to mention that obviously not all ecologically important changes happen rapidly. Not all of them are critical transitions, but we're living during a time when many of our Earth systems are changing quickly. And so we should continue to try to anticipate how these rapid changes will shape our planet. So with that, thank you very much for listening to me today. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Thanks a lot, Allison. I am so sorry for the Zoom bomber. That's our first
no problem.
This seminar series. I know that we have one question in the chat. If folks have questions, please feel free to either ask aloud or place them in the chat. And I'll start with the first question in the chat, and then we can go from there.